The Developer Direct Showcase dropped some flaming hot and brand new Redfall gameplay for us to comb through, and lucky for you, I did exactly that. I examined each piece of the gameplay frame by frame and have delivered unto you, the viewers, all of the details and hidden secrets within the newest gameplay trailer for Redfall. So let's not drag this out, you already know the drill. Starting off, we get this really cool cinematic, almost like a painting in motion, with a little bit of bloody B-roll footage thrown in for good measure. This shot here, we see our heroes and some of the civilian survivors on a boat just outside of Redfall's harbor, watching what appears to be some kind of ritual as a massive aura of red energy is cast outwards from the town. Then we, presumably, see one of the vampire gods mentioned further on in the trailer. This one, based off of the visual design, mainly the Eclipse headdress, appears to be the main antagonist of Redfall, the Black Sun, a name that was revealed by Harvey Smith in the interview with Games Radar that my previous Redfall video focused on. Link to that video in the description, and also the top right corner of the video player, right about now. Harvey mentioned in the article that the Black Sun is the chief baddie among the vampires, as she was the one who placed the sun in a never-ending eclipse over the island. We'll see more of her later on, and I have a feeling she'll have a pretty big role to play in Redfall's larger narrative once we actually play through the game. Next, we get a little footage of a brief combat encounter in the streets, showing off how a full party of 4 players can decimate the enemies. One thing that did stick out to me about this part is when this enemy dies, they spurt out these 2 glowing red bags that are most likely health pickups, and we also see these glowing items on the ground that are likely ammo drops for your weapons. It wouldn't be an Arcane Studios game without movement mechanics like sliding. Finally, we begin the proper deep dive into Redfall, beginning with voiceover narration from Harvey Smith, studio director at Arcane Austin and co-creative director on Redfall. Fun fact, apparently Harvey's favorite vampire hunter is none other than the Marvel Comics character Blade, because who doesn't love Wesley Snipes, am I right, guys?
Are you out of your damn mind?
Guys. Anyway, here we have an overhead shot of part of the harbor district of downtown Redfall, and what almost immediately stuck out to me was the crashing waves that have been suspended in mid-air around the edges of the harbor, blocking any and all survivors from fleeing via boat or watercraft. This is just one more thing that amplifies the isolation you'll feel being stuck on the island with the vampires. It also goes to show, alongside the eclipsing of the sun, just how powerful these creatures really are, and how much of a challenge it will be to defeat them. We can also see from this top-down view of the harbor just how open and expansive this one small area of the map can be. I already am seeing several different routes to take and ways to explore and discover just by looking at this single frame. I've always said Arcane are the masters of modern level design, so let's see what they do here with the Far Cry-esque open world. Quick cut to the next shot, which looks like some kind of butterfly garden? Probably just a small side area to explore, or maybe part of the main quest, but who knows. Now we get an even closer look at the Black Sun, which I mentioned previously, and who I still believe is our main antagonist of Redfall. She looks appropriately creepy here in what I am assuming is a pre-rendered cutscene, probably during the opening hours of the game, where the threat of the vampires and their power is established, and it sets the stakes for the narrative to follow. As a side note, I'm pretty sure we heard some of her voice lines in a previous trailer, and it sounded a lot like the talented actress Deborah Wilson, who has voiced a multitude of different characters in video games, but for me, most notably, is Grace Walker from Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus, and Savathun, the hive god of cunning and deceit from Destiny 2's expansion, The Witch Queen. This has not been officially confirmed casting, but if anyone from Arcane watches this, I'd love to know for sure, so let me know in the comments or shoot me a DM over on Twitter. Some more B-roll footage here of Jacob walking through a lonely street, and then all 4 characters entering different rooms in this haunted house, Scooby-Doo style. Here's our first look at the character selection screen, where we get a good look at at each character's backstory and, more importantly, their special abilities. Jacob Boyer comes first. Jacob moves like a ghost. After years as a Special Forces sniper, he flipped to corporate contracts working with Bellwether Security. That gig eventually brought him to Redfall, where an encounter with one of the vampire gods left him with strange powers and a ghostly raven companion. Growing up as a foster kid, Jacob is used to tough situations, but the conniving vampires on the island will test his limits. Interesting note about his encounter with one of the vampire gods, the Black Sun perhaps, gave him his spectral raven and his ghostly eye, which coincidentally play into his ability set. The raven can be sent out to mark targets, as we see later in the trailer. The cloak ability gives Jacob invisibility for a short duration, which once again we'll be seeing a little later on. Then there's the ultimate ability, Heartstopper, which I'm assuming is the power where he summons a spectral sniper rifle and goes into aimbot mode, popping headshots like no one's business. Jacob ultimately seems like the perfect character for the stealthy and tactical player, which fits my playstyle fairly closely, so Jacob could potentially be the first character that I decide to play as. Next up is Layla Ellison. Layla's mind is a telekinetic weapon. She came to Redfall to attend the local university, but after volunteering for a shady medical study by Avum Therapeutics, she emerged with some of the vampire's amazing psychic abilities, though none of their appetite for blood. Her graduate school plan was to study vascular mechanics on the way to a biomed degree, all in the name of helping people. Now, thanks to her special powers, Layla finds herself in a desperate struggle to save the remaining survivors living in the shadows of Redfall. It's again mentioned that Layla took part in a shady experiment conducted by the scientists at Avum Therapeutics, the company that basically are single-handedly responsible for the vampire epidemic due to their meddling with human age and longevity. Also, Arcane seems to have taken a page out of Resident Evil's book by giving us another evil mega corporation in the same vein as Umbrella. We already know about Layla's lift ability, where she summons a spectral elevator that can shoot her teammates up into the sky to gain an aerial advantage. The Umbrella can be used to absorb bullets and cast them back at the enemy in a blast of psychic energy. Her ultimate ability, though, Vampire Ex-Boyfriend, hilarious name by the way, still remains a mystery as we don't quite know how it functions yet. Still, Layla will fill the archetype of a spellcaster or mage role from the looks of it, which has also been a favorite playstyle of mine in the past. On to Devinder Crowsley. Dev is an internet-famous cryptid hunter and ghost chaser. From his home in the UK, he's spent years documenting the weird and the hidden. After visiting Redfall to promote his latest book, Like a Mothman to the Flame, Dev finds himself trapped with no way to stream to his eager fans. Relying on his eccentric inventions to confound and destroy his enemies, he's as shocked as they are to discover that at last his fringe technologies actually work. One part terrified, one part fascinated, Dev searches for a way off the island, or at least a way online. It sounds like Devinder suffers from a crippling addiction to live streaming and entertaining his social media followers, which grounds him in this weird reality in a fantastically funny way. He also seems like he'll be the primary source of comedic relief throughout the grim and dark story of Redfall. His abilities center primarily around his makeshift gadgetry. We've seen the arc javelin before, as it can be thrown into a group of enemies to temporarily immobilize them for a quick kill. We saw translocate briefly in one of the previous trailers, and I thought it might have been a special grenade of some kind, but it is actually a short-range teleport that can be used to close the gap on your foes, as Harvey Smith mentions later on in the trailer. Also, it wouldn't really be an Arcane game without some kind of teleport ability. Lastly, Devinder's ultimate ability, Blacklight, is a staff that is slammed into the ground and shoots out a petrifying beam of UV light in an area of effect bubble. This can stop the vampires dead in their tracks, similarly to the arc javelin, so it seems that Devinder will be filling the role of the gadget-focused crowd control character, which sounds perfect in a co-op session. Last character is Remy De La Rosa. Remy has dedicated her life to rescuing people from disaster zones, though vampires are, admittedly, a new twist. As a combat engineer with a degree from MIT, she and her prototype robot Bribon were an obvious choice to train Coast Guard personnel in Redfall on bot-assisted search and rescue. As the eldest in her family, Remy sees herself as a protector, the one to rely on. She will use her technical expertise and everything at her disposal to try to help those trapped on the island, except the bloodsuckers. Now, Remy has a military background similar to Jacob, but different in many ways. She was training Coast Guard personnel on bot-assisted search and rescue, which sounds like a pretty cool lore tidbit because up until this point, I had thought that Bribone was the only bot of its kind, so it's interesting to hear that there's more out there. There's only one Bribone though, and he is absolutely adorable, of course. Looking at her ability set, this is the most intriguing mixture of powers in my opinion. Her first one is the C4 charge, which again, we have seen this used in some previous footage, and later on in this deep dive gameplay we'll see more of it. I had thought initially that it was a special grenade type, much like Devinder's Translocate, but I guess Redfall won't have traditional grenades in that sense, which is fine. The C4 charge ability will be really good at clearing out a large group of enemies or even setting traps for said enemies. The Siren ability we end up seeing later on, where Bribone distracts enemies with a funny little light show, good for stealth, or just redirecting enemies away from yourself, I imagine. Finally, her ultimate ability, Mobilize, seems like it provides some kind of healing or damage buff, in addition to instantly reviving fallen allies, which again is something that we'll be seeing later on. Here's a shot of Layla's lift ability, sending her and her teammates soaring into the air, something we'll see more practical combat use for much later. Next, we see this warped-looking section of a house with floating debris left behind by the psychic imprint. Props to the sound team for making the act of staking a vampire through the heart sound appropriately crunchy. Ricardo Bear starts his portion of the narration here, talking about how the world in Arcane's games are a character unto themselves, and Redfall will be no different. Small detail, Ricardo's favorite vampire is Nandor the Relentless, a reference to the popular What We Do in the Shadows television show. Here's a closer look at a small cultist outpost of some kind, complete with grotesque amounts of blood and bodies. Also, a closer look at the wall of water surrounding the harbor, complete with boats and lifeguard towers in suspended animation. It's a really cool visual aesthetic there. The next shot gives us a really good look at the scale of the open world and how just this one image dwarfs the size of Talos 1 from Prey. Just look at all these locations, and it's Arcane we're talking about here, so we'll be able to see all of it. No borders or invisible walls. Ricardo goes on to say that every inch of this open world is filled with handcrafted content and environmental storytelling. We always love to see this in an Arcane game. During the montage showing different areas of the world in various stages of disarray, we can briefly spot this arcade machine with the name Immersive Kim, a not so subtle reference to the genre of game that has been Arcane Studios' bread and butter since the company was founded. The more footage we see of this environment that Arcane created, the more I can understand and see the small town New England vibe they were trying to capture with the setting, and I personally feel they've already accomplished that in spades. I wanted to point out this shot of these strange cultist structures specifically because of this spectral door suspended from the crane. This is probably one of the doors we see later in the trailer where you are able to enter a vampire nest and strike at the literal heart of the vampire's power. Next, we get a much better aerial view of the seaside boardwalk, once again showing the scale of not just the open world as a whole, but each individual district on the map. Now we're seeing some of the hub areas or safe zones, where you can talk with NPCs and get either main quests or side quests, or you can just chat and learn more about the island of Redfall and its history. First is the Redfall Maritime Center, then the local fire station, and what looks like a local museum, or maybe it's just the interior of the Maritime Center. This particular NPC looks like a local nurse, and will probably be providing a couple of side quests, in addition to providing the player with medical supplies. Here's a good look at the interior of the fire station here. On the upper floor of the fire station that we saw just a few seconds ago, we have what looks like our mission board, where we can decide which objectives to to tackle and in what order. Ricardo does mention that this is not the only place where you can pick up missions, which makes sense because there are multiple hub areas, like the Maritime Center mentioned earlier. It reminds me a lot of the mission board on the Dreadful Whale from Dishonored 2, just as a personal note. Moving on to one particular side quest, we have an NPC narration telling us that we need to reactivate the lighthouse to steer seafaring ships away from the island as a warning. However, the lighthouse keeper decided to defect and join the cultist group, allying himself with the vampires. Our goal is to eliminate the cultists guarding the home where the lighthouse bulb is being held, collect the missing piece, and return it to the lighthouse. Jacob approaches the home, sending out the Raven first to mark the enemies, then activating the cloak to get in close without being noticed. Here we get a good look at one of the unique vampire types, the Shroud, which, as Ricardo says, blankets the area in darkness, which disorients the player while also lobbing projectiles at you from a distance. They can even disappear underground for a short time to avoid taking damage. Pretty cool to see this particular enemy type showcased, and it gives us just a tiny little taste of the enemy variety that will be present in Redfall. When the vampire enters its weakened state after taking enough damage, Jacob opts to finish it off by firing a flare to burn it to a crisp. Going for the takedown animation involving staking the vampire probably leaves you vulnerable to other attacks, so in the middle of a hectic firefight, quickly dispatching the vampires will be an important tactical decision, so a flare gun will undoubtedly come in handy for a large portion of the campaign's runtime. As Jacob enters the home, we see a brief glimpse at what looks like a squirrel in colonial-era clothing? Maybe a collectible of some kind, or even a valuable item you can trade for resources? The bloodied graffiti on the floor reads, "The blood is a part of me, and I am the blood." Creepy, to say the least. Jacob breaks the wooden boards blocking the entryway to his objective, and we see these various items with glowing blue orbs, which I had initially believed to be physical indicators of experience points, but I now think they could be something else entirely. Nice jump scare. With the dark and gritty tone Arcane seems to be capturing with Redfall, there will definitely be some horror influences here, which is nice to see since the last Arcane game we got that featured plenty of terrifying moments was Prey, coincidentally from the same folks at Arcane Austin who are now developing Redfall. Interesting detail I noticed here was the framed advertisement for this whale of a soap, a reference to the coastal culture of the small town of Redfall, but also probably a reference to the whales from Dishonored. Jacob whips out the stake launcher weapon and quickly dispatches the ambushing vampire. And can I just say, I cannot wait to use this weapon. It looks so cool. Now we cut forward to Jacob entering the lighthouse and showing the first proper usage of the cloak for stealth purposes to avoid this particular vampire. Objective complete. Now we move on to what is one of my favorite parts of the gameplay shown here, as we get our first look at the vampiric creature known as the Rook, an enemy that can seemingly appear procedurally based on how angry you've made the vampire gods. This enemy reminds me a lot of the Nightmare from Prey, a creature in the Typhon ecosystem designed and created for one singular purpose, to hunt you down. The Nightmare in Prey was terrifying, and every interaction I ever had with it chilled me to the bone, and I have a feeling the Rook will be no different. I mean, look at this thing. This is the stuff that actual nightmares are made of. Also interesting how the red lightning seems to be a visual signal to the player that the Rook is preparing to arrive. Harvey Smith takes over the narration again here and brings us to another section of the open world involving a random encounter where we need to rescue trapped survivors at the Midnight Whale Brewery. Once again, we have another nautical reference here. In this segment, we actually shift our perspective over to Remy and we get a glimpse at some of her weapons and skill set. We get to see some of the siren ability I mentioned earlier, where Remy's robot companion distracts enemies with a little waggle from its antenna, which looks hilarious. Remy opts to go in quietly instead of kicking in the front door and takes the ladder to the roof. Again, guys, whatever happened to ladders? Only kidding, but not really. Seriously, what happened to it? We get our first look here at some of the looting mechanics for Redfall, because just to reiterate, this will have heavy elements borrowed from the looter-shooter genre, including randomized weapons and stats. Here's some more of the blood bag enemy types we've seen in previous gameplay, and these enemies will function as living bombs, doing massive area of effect damage if you're not careful or engaging them from a safe distance. One thing I do want to mention here is that environmental hazards will play a big part in how you deal with the different groups of enemies, the puddle of flammable oil here being just one example. Another blue glowing object on the table in the corner, which could be one of the remnants, powerful vampire artifacts that grant different passive buffs to the player. We'll see one of these remnants later in the deep dive. Remy makes quick work of the cultists and the vampires holding the survivors hostage and completes this short rescue mission. Moving on, we enter a psychic vampire nest, which interestingly, as Harvey Smith mentions here, have a certain degree of procedural generation, as when you enter a nest, the layout is completely different each time you enter, making for a harrowing experience no matter how many nests you clear. No two vampire nests will ever be exactly the same. Now we've taken control of Devinder for this segment involving the vampire nest, and we see how the translocate ability functions, as Dev tosses out this small and presumably handmade device that allows him to close the gap on the vampires below. He follows that up with the arc javelin, which stuns the vampires and allows for them to be quickly finished off. Devinder uses the UV beam weapon to completely petrify one of the vampires and delivers the final blow with a good old-fashioned elbow to the face. To close the psychic nest, you have to destroy the heart, which is apparently linked to these poor unfortunate souls. Not quite sure how these nests are actually created, but it would seem that the life force of these victims is being used to power the nest itself. Devinder says it best, but man, this does look like a very gruesome way to die. By removing their tethers, you begin the process of destroying the heart, but it signals a wave of enemies that arrive to prevent you from accomplishing your objective. Now, when the vampires do arrive to attack the group, Devinder pulls out this special pistol variant that we haven't seen before. It seems to fire electrically powered bullets, which I guess do more damage. Maybe they also have a small chance to stun the vampires? A lot of the weapons in Redfall will have interesting modifiers or attachments like these, and this will help to keep the loot pool fresh and constantly rotating. One of the many major reasons why looter shooters are always so popular, because you're always hankering to find that newer and more powerful firearm. After killing the vampires, Devinder turns back to finish the heart, and just a small insignificant detail I noticed is that when Devinder turns around, there are still two tethers remaining linked to the heart. However, when this cut happens, the tethers have disappeared. So just an interesting and almost almost literally meaningless thing I picked up on while in the editing room. Devinder destroys the heart and the nest begins to crumble around them. It's a harrowing race to the exit, while still gathering as much loot as possible, like this vampire remnant, something that I mentioned earlier. This particular remnant looks like it just boosts your maximum health, so it's a pretty basic upgrade, but still an important one nonetheless. As Devinder and the others make their escape, he manages to loot this nest victim for a flare gun and some other items like ammo and potentially crafting or trading resources. After making their way out of the vampire nest, we see a little bit more B-roll of different environments, including this home with one corner blasted outwards due to some kind of psychic event. This is very similar to the particular section of the deep dive that we saw earlier. Next, we see Layla making her way through a creepy wooded section with various keys hanging from suspended ropes, before being ensnared by the Angler, another of the special vampire types, this one functioning similarly to the Smoker enemy from Left 4 Dead, cutting off and isolating a single player from the rest of the group. Susan Kath, the business director at Arcane Austin, takes over the narration now, talking about how one of your main objectives outside of the story quests is to take back Redfall, one neighborhood at a time. Susan's favorite vampire song is Living Dead Girl, and I'm assuming it's the version sung by Rob Zombie. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. We get this brief glimpse at some strange crystalline object in this tunnel, and it's got a similar look to some of the stuff we saw in the vampire nest earlier, like the heart of the nest and the victims of the vampires that have been almost cocooned inside these strange crystals. There will almost certainly be a lore explanation for this, but it's still pretty interesting. Here we see one of the many smaller safe houses scattered around the island, where you can rest and recuperate before venturing back out into the open world. Eventually, once you've taken back most of each neighborhood, you'll have to confront the vampire in control of the area, known as the Siphon. The name Siphon is really interesting because these vampires seem to be not only interested in blood sucking, but also sucking the hope and life out of the residents of Redfall. A major theme of the game that was mentioned by Harvey Smith during an interview in last year's gameplay showcase was this idea of the vampires representing the wealthy 1% of the country, bleeding everyone else dry while they line themselves with riches. And we as the players, representing some of the lower class, have to be able to band together to stop them. It's about finding common ground with your neighbors, friends, and family to retake control that was unjustly ripped from our hands. Redfall might seem like a skin-deep experience, but Arcane's narrative team have always done an excellent job weaving in real-world ideas and concepts into their stories, which adds to the immersion you as the player experience. Moving on, the shot of this clock tower shows the time at approximately 2:36 p.m. I honestly struggled for a bit trying to find out what the time on the clock was, which just goes to show you how terrible I am at reading clocks. But the Redfall Twitter account later posted a tweet saying it's 2:36 p.m. in Redfall. Next, we see this massive tree with more of the red crystal stuff at the bottom. I love this part because we really get to see all four of the characters use their abilities and weapons in conjunction with one another. We get to see some of Remy's C4 charge ability, as well as her ultimate ability, Mobilize, which, as I mentioned earlier in the video, seems to provide some kind of buff while also instantly allowing you to revive your downed teammates. Now, one of the most important parts of the deep dive is here, where we get a better look at some of the skill tree upgrades and how you can customize your character's playstyle. This is just one character, but the different paths along the skill trees here honestly look like they put the ability skill trees in Dishonored and Prey to shame. The skill tree this section focuses on is primarily for Layla's lift ability. The first upgrade we can see is called Hold the Lift, which makes the lift last longer before vanishing. The next one is called One More Floor, which allows for lift to launch yourself and your teammates even higher into the air, which we get to see in action as Layla sends Jacob up to pull off a sweet sniper rifle shot in midair. Now we see one of the upgrades for Layla's umbrella ability called Bullet Hail, which allows the player to absorb damage from enemy fire and send it back, doing immense amounts of damage based on how many bullets you absorb beforehand. We then get to see it here in practice, and Layla nails this poor fool with a headshot from her revolver. The group finishes off the vampires and the massive tree vanishes into a wisp of red sparks. Now we get a brief glimpse at Jacob's skill trees, and in particular, the skill tree for his aimbot ultimate ability, Heartstopper. The upgrade we see here is called Extended Magazine, which is pretty self-explanatory. It allows Jacob to use the Heartstopper ability for a longer period of time, with more ammo as a complement. Next up is Devinder's skill tree for the Blacklight ultimate ability. In fact, this upgrade is the final upgrade in the Blacklight skill tree, which sounds awesome. Ultra-Violent Light increases the duration of Blacklight, the radius of the AoE effect, and the staff also explodes at the end of its duration, shattering any vampire caught by its petrifying effects. Here we get a little B-roll of some of the awesome-looking weapons we can loot and use against the vampires, some of them with wholly unique designs, like this rifle with a bone and sinew type aesthetic, complete with a unique sight attachment. This is probably an ultra rarity weapon if I had to guess. After Devinder destroys this police cruiser in a fiery explosion, we see some more of the weapon customization options, specifically our stake mods that we can attach to the barrel of our guns. There are many different and unique stakes to choose from, including this electric guitar head among other things. It's really cool to see Arcane giving the players the ability to create their own vampire hunting weapon of choice, to a certain extent. Damn, listen to the crunchiness of that staking animation. I just still can't get over that. Now we're back in Jacob's shoes as he whips out this map of different locations on the island. I believe these are some of the safe house locations we've been told about, and these might even be fast travel points that we can use to quickly navigate the open world. The Maritime Center is listed here on the map, and we even caught a glimpse at this particular building earlier in the video, which is why I think these are the hub areas we can rest and regroup at. The other notable locations listed here are the Burial Point Cemetery, Coast Guard Station, Bladewell Campgrounds, the Amphitheater, Last Chance Gift Shop, and the Smith Family Orchard. Susan Kath continues her narration talking about how once we've taken back enough of a particular area of the map, we then need to face the vampire underboss, much like the Siphon mentioned earlier. The vampire underboss is in charge of the area, and they have to be defeated in order to finally free a given neighborhood from their control. The vampire underbosses share their character models with many of the average vampire enemy types I've noticed, but some of them will have unique abilities of their own, like this spinning force field that will block projectile attacks. Once the underboss has been defeated, you're able to pick up the remains of their skull and use it as a key to gain access to the most difficult opponents in Redfall, the vampire gods themselves. Now this big fella, we honestly don't know a whole lot about, but I'm pretty sure his name is Bloody Tom. Why do I think that's his name? Well, on the Arcane Studios Discord server, content creators like myself were given access to special screenshots from Redfall, and one of them is this screenshot that doubles as the thumbnail for this video. The name of the screenshot, though, just so happens to be bloodytomreveal.png. So yeah, Bloody Tom here is gonna give us one hell of a fight. Now, Harvey Smith, Ricardo Bear, and Susan Kath appear in the flesh to thank everyone for supporting Arcane Studios over the years. You're welcome. And they also talk about one of the many reasons why Arcane will always be my favorite game developer. They create the games that they themselves want to play, creatively unrestrained from publisher intrusion and direction. I get the feeling a lot of development teams these days just don't enjoy the games they create or even bother to play them in many respects. For some, it's just a job, and that's totally understandable. The best kind of games, though, are the ones that you can just tell have had so much love and passion poured into them, and those are the kind of games that Arcane create. The hope is always that if you make something you enjoy, others will see your determination and effort and come to enjoy it themselves. Arcane makes the games they love and want to play, and we, the fans, love them and want to play them too. We also now finally have a firm release date for Redfall, May 2nd, 2023. Don't know about y'all, but I'm taking off work that day. Whew, okay, we're almost done. A couple more pieces of B-roll footage to sift through, and then we eventually see this guy, who I'm pretty sure is another one of the vampire gods that we can fight. He looks an awful lot like the one we saw in the CGI reveal trailer, wouldn't you agree? This boss fight also seems to take place in the butterfly garden that we saw at the beginning of the trailer. Now, I don't know for sure if this is another one of the vampire gods or not. It honestly looks like a much larger version of the standard blood bag enemy type we've seen before. The size of this guy, though, makes me think this is probably another of the vampire gods, which means we've already been shown at least 3 different boss characters in this trailer alone. I'm loving the enemy variety we've seen thus far in the gameplay trailers. Next, we see some of the human cultists being either ritually sacrificed by this angler vampire or being turned into vampires themselves. It'll be really cool to see this happen procedurally as we explore the open world. Finally, we get one last glimpse at the Rook howling into the void. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of my personal analysis of the Redfall Developer Direct gameplay footage. Now I want to know what you think in the comments down below. Did this deep dive into Redfall make you more excited for the game? Has this dampened your enthusiasm for Redfall? What are your thoughts on the new enemy types, weapon customization, and the open world activities? Sound off and let's discuss. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like on the video and share it around with other members of the Bethesda and Arcane Outsiders community. It really helps the channel to grow and get noticed. Consider subscribing to the channel for more in-depth Redfall content like this, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember that the outsider walks among us. Thanks for watching, everyone.